The carriage wheels stopped hard against the frozen ground, and Duke Alistair Renfield stepped down, with a face like stone. He had come to the workhouse at dawn for one reason only, and he did not want to waste a single minute on kindness or small talk. Behind him, his lawyer, Mr. Pruitt, hurried to keep up, clutching a leather folder against his chest, as if it might fly away in the wind. "You are certain about this, Your Grace?" Mr. Pruitt asked, his voice shaking slightly from the cold, or from nerves. It was hard to tell which. "I am certain," Alistair said. "Bring me the matron." Inside the workhouse, the air smelled of boiled cabbage and old wood smoke. Rows of thin children sat on benches, sewing or peeling potatoes, their eyes following the tall stranger in the fine black coat. None of them had ever seen a duke before. Alistair did not look at them. He had trained himself long ago not to look too closely at anything that might ask something of his heart. The matron, a stern woman named Mrs. Holt, came out wiping her hands on her apron. When she heard why the duke had come, her mouth opened in surprise, then closed again quickly, because one did not question a duke. "You want a wife," she repeated slowly. "From here, I want a bride who will not talk," Alistair said flatly. "A bride who cannot tell me lies, cannot beg for my affection, and cannot break promises with pretty words. I have heard you have such a girl." Mrs. Holt's face grew pale, then thoughtful. She knew exactly who he meant. "Elira," she said quietly. She lost her voice as a small child. "A fever took it, or perhaps something worse happened to her before she came to us. We never learned the full truth. She has not spoken a single word in 10 years. But she is gentle, Your Grace. She is good." "Good is not what I am looking for," Alistair said. "Silent is what I am looking for. Bring her to me." Mr. Pruitt shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Your Grace, perhaps we should consider a lady of proper standing, someone who will smile at my face and scheme behind my back," Alistair interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp as a blade. "I have already had that lesson once, Pruitt. I will not have it twice." His mind flashed, uninvited, to a night 3 years earlier. Candlelight, a ballroom, a woman named Clarissa Vane, laughing with another man's arm around her waist, while Alistair stood by the door, holding a ring meant for her finger. He pushed the memory down hard, the way he always did, burying it beneath layers of duty and cold discipline. A few minutes later, Mrs. Holt returned, leading a young woman by the hand. Elira was perhaps 20 years old, thin from years of workhouse meals, wearing a plain gray dress that had clearly been mended many times. Her hair was the color of wheat, pulled back simply, and her eyes were a deep, quiet brown, the kind of eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations, even though her lips never moved. She did not look afraid. She looked steady, the way people look when they have already survived worse things than a stranger's stare. Alistair studied her for a long moment. She did not flinch under his gaze, nor did she try to please him with a smile, the way other women often did. She simply waited, her hands folded in front of her, watching him with calm, careful eyes. "Do you understand why I am here?" Alistair asked her directly, though he already knew she could not answer aloud. Elira nodded once. "And you agree to this? A marriage, in name, to a stranger, with no promise of love or affection?" Elira looked at Mrs. Holt, then back at Alistair. Slowly, she nodded again. Behind her calm expression, something flickered, not fear exactly, but a kind of quiet hope that she quickly hid away, as if she had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing to show. Mr. Pruitt cleared his throat nervously. "Your Grace, if I may ask, why does the lady's silence matter so much to you? A written contract of marriage requires no spoken vows from her, only her signature and yours." Alistair turned toward the window, watching frost patterns creep across the glass. "Because words are how people wound each other, Pruitt. A woman who cannot speak, cannot promise me forever, and then take it back. She cannot whisper false comfort into my ear while planning her escape. She cannot break my trust with her voice." He did not explain that beneath this cold logic sat a much simpler truth, one he refused to admit even to himself. He was afraid. Afraid of ever again handing his heart to someone who could crush it with a single sentence. Papers were signed that very afternoon, in the workhouse office, the ink still wet when Elira placed her signature beside his, her handwriting neat and careful, despite the roughness of her life. Mrs. Holt cried a little as she hugged Elira goodbye, whispering something in her ear that made Elira's eyes shine with unshed tears. The wedding itself, 3 days later, was small and quiet, held in the private chapel of Renfield Hall, with only a handful of witnesses. There were no flowers, no music, no joyful gathering of family. Elira wore a simple, pale blue dress that the housekeeper had found for her, and she stood beside Alistair at the altar, with her chin lifted, dignified, despite everything. The elderly priest, Father Whitmore, glanced uncertainly at Alistair as he reached the part of the ceremony requiring spoken vows. "Your Grace, the lady cannot speak her vows aloud. How shall we?" "She will place her hand upon the book instead," Alistair said, his voice carrying easily through the empty chapel. "That will be vow enough." Elira placed her hand gently on the old leather Bible, her eyes meeting Alistair's for just a moment. There was no love in that look, not yet. Only two strangers agreeing to share a life neither of them had chosen, for reasons of the heart. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, no embrace, no joyful cheer from the small gathering. Alistair simply extended his arm, and Elira took it, and together, they walked out of the chapel, into the gray afternoon light. Already man and wife, already strangers bound together for the rest of their days. The carriage ride back to Renfield Hall was long and silent, though Elira did not seem to mind the quiet the way another bride might have. She watched the passing countryside through the window, her expression calm, almost peaceful, as though she had already made her decision to accept whatever life brought her next. Alistair, seated across from her, found himself glancing at her more than once, studying the curve of her cheek, the steady rhythm of her breathing, wondering what thoughts moved behind those quiet brown eyes. He told himself it was simple curiosity, nothing more, the same curiosity one might feel toward an unfamiliar painting or a locked door. When they arrived at Renfield Hall, the entire household staff had gathered in the front hall to greet their new Duchess. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, stepped forward first, offering a warm smile and a small curtsy. "Welcome home, Your Grace," she said gently to Elira. "We have prepared the East Wing chambers for you, with a lovely view of the garden." Elira offered a small, grateful smile in return, and something about that simple gesture, so quiet and genuine, made several of the younger maids exchange soft, curious glances. They had expected a great lady, proud and demanding. Instead, they found a gentle young woman who thanked them with her eyes because she could not thank them with her voice. The steward, Edmund Cole, a serious man who managed the estate's finances, bowed stiffly and said nothing beyond the required greeting. He had already heard rumors among the staff that the Duke had married an orphan who could not speak, and he did not entirely approve, though he knew better than to voice such thoughts aloud. That evening, dinner was served in the grand dining hall, though the table felt far too large for only 2 people. Alistair sat at one end, Elira at the other, the long stretch of polished wood between them like an unspoken wall. Servants moved silently around them, filling wine glasses and clearing plates, while the only sounds in the room were the soft clink of silverware and the crackle of the fireplace. Alistair made no effort at conversation, and Elira, of course, could offer none aloud. Yet she did not seem uncomfortable with the silence. She ate slowly, glancing occasionally toward the tall windows, where the last light of evening painted the gardens in shades of orange and purple, her expression thoughtful and distant, as if her mind wandered somewhere far beyond the dining hall walls. After dinner, Alistair retreated to his study, as he did every evening, burying himself in ledgers and letters concerning the estate. He told himself this was simply his habit, his duty as Duke, nothing more. Yet some part of him noticed, uncomfortably, that he had spent more time that day thinking about his new wife's quiet eyes than about the numbers in front of him. Meanwhile, Elira explored her new chambers slowly, running her fingers over the fine furniture, the soft blankets, the small writing desk near the window, where she could already imagine herself sitting to compose notes when she needed to communicate. It was more comfort than she had known in 10 long years at the workhouse, yet comfort alone could not fill the quiet ache of loneliness that settled over her as she looked out at the darkening gardens. She thought of Mrs. Holt's parting words, whispered just before the carriage took her away. "Every heart holds a song, my dear, even a silent one. Someday, someone will hear yours." Elira touched her throat gently, remembering the voice she once had, so long ago, before the fever, before the loss that had taken it from her. She remembered, faintly, a woman's gentle humming beside her childhood bed, a lullaby without words, a melody that lived somewhere deep inside her chest even now, waiting for the right moment to be set free. Outside her window, the last light faded from the sky, and Renfield Hall settled into its familiar nighttime silence. Neither the Duke in his study, nor the new Duchess in her chambers could have guessed, on that first strange night of their marriage, just how deeply their lives were about to change, or how soon a simple, secret melody would begin to crack open a heart that had been locked away for years. For now, there was only silence, and two strangers beginning a marriage neither of them had wanted for love, though fate, as it often does, had other plans entirely. The next morning arrived cold and bright, sunlight spilling across the frost-covered gardens of Renfield Hall. Elira woke early, as she always had at the workhouse, her body still trained to rise before dawn, even though no one here demanded such discipline of her. For a moment, lying in the soft, unfamiliar bed, she almost forgot where she was. Then the memory of yesterday returned, the wedding, the silent vows, the long carriage ride, and she understood that her old life was truly gone. She dressed quietly in a simple morning gown, left for her by the maids, and made her way downstairs, uncertain of where she belonged in this enormous house. The hallways stretched on endlessly, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch her every step with silent judgment. She paused before one painting in particular, a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile, so different from the others. "That is the old Duchess Beatrice," came a voice behind her. Mrs. Whitfield had appeared, carrying a tray of morning tea, His Grace's grandmother. "She is very ill now, poor soul. But she was the one who insisted the Duke marry before taking full control of the estate. She wanted him settled, happy, before she passed on." Elira tilted her head, curious, and Mrs. Whitfield seemed to understand the unspoken question in her eyes. "She has not yet met you," the housekeeper explained gently. "She has been too unwell these past weeks, but I imagine she will ask for you soon. She is a sharp woman, even in illness, and she notices everything." Elira nodded, filing this information away carefully. She sensed, without being told directly, that this grandmother's wishes had played some hidden role in her sudden marriage, though she could not yet understand the full shape of it. Breakfast that morning was, once again, a quiet affair, though this time Alistair arrived at the table already dressed for a day of estate business, his expression distracted and distant. He barely glanced at Elira as he took his seat, his mind clearly occupied with matters far beyond the dining hall. "I will be riding out to the eastern farms today," he said, more to himself than to her, as he reviewed a stack of papers beside his plate. "Edmund tells me there are disputes among the tenant farmers that require my attention." Elira listened politely, though there was little for her to respond with, beyond a small nod. She noticed, however, the tension in his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw, and wondered what troubles truly weighed on this cold, guarded man she had married. After he departed for the farms, the great house grew even quieter, and Elira found herself wandering its many rooms with nothing but her own thoughts for company. She discovered the library first, its shelves rising all the way to the ceiling, filled with more books than she had ever seen in her life. She ran her fingers along the spines reverently, promising herself she would return here often. Further down the hall, she found a smaller, dustier room that had clearly not been used in some time. Faded curtains hung over tall windows, and beneath a thin layer of dust sat a collection of small wooden toys, a rocking horse with a chipped ear, and a child's writing slate propped against the wall. "That was the nursery," came a soft voice from the doorway. A young kitchen maid named Nora stood there, a cloth in her hands as though she had been sent to clean, but had paused at the sight of Elira standing among the old toys. "It hasn't been used in many years, not since His Grace was a boy himself. Some say he keeps meaning to have it cleared out, but he never does." Elira ran her fingers gently over the rocking horse, feeling an odd tenderness toward this forgotten room. She wondered, briefly, what kind of child the cold, distant Duke had once been, before whatever happened in his life had turned him so guarded and closed. Later that week, word arrived that the elderly Duchess Beatrice wished to see her new granddaughter-in-law. Elira felt a flutter of nervousness as Mrs. Whitfield led her up to the grandmother's private chambers, a warm room filled with the scent of lavender and old books. Duchess Beatrice sat propped against a mountain of pillows, her once strong frame now thin and frail, though her eyes remained sharp and bright as she studied Alira carefully from head to toe. "So," the old woman said, her voice raspy but firm, "you are the girl my grandson chose because you cannot speak. Come closer, child, let me look at you properly." Alira approached obediently, standing beside the bed with her hands folded, and the Duchess reached out with a thin, wrinkled hand to gently touch Alira's cheek. "He thinks silence protects him," Beatrice murmured, almost to herself. "Foolish boy. Silence protects nothing. It only delays the wound." She studied Alira's face a moment longer, then smiled faintly. "But you have kind eyes, my dear. Kinder than that scheming girl he almost married before. Perhaps there is hope in this arrangement yet, even if my grandson cannot see it himself." Alira tilted her head curiously, and Beatrice seemed to understand the silent question. "Clarissa Vane," the old woman said, her voice hardening slightly. "A beautiful, clever creature who broke my grandson's heart 3 years past, right before their own wedding, no less. She ran off with another man's fortune the very week Alistair intended to marry her. He has not trusted a woman's voice since that day. That is why he chose you, child, though I suspect even he does not fully understand his own reasons." Alira absorbed this information slowly, pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fit together. She understood now why Alistair kept such distance, why his eyes carried such careful guardedness whenever they happened to meet hers. "Do not be discouraged by his coldness," Beatrice continued, patting Alira's hand gently. "My grandson has a good heart buried somewhere beneath all that ice. It simply needs the right kind of warmth to melt it free again. I am old, and I will not live to see it happen, I think, but perhaps you might be the one to thaw him, in time." Alira left the Duchess's chambers that afternoon with much to consider, her mind turning over everything she had learned. She understood now that her marriage was not simply a matter of convenience for Alistair, but a wall he had built brick by brick around a heart that had once been badly broken. As the days passed into weeks, a quiet routine settled over Renfield Hall. Alistair rose early and spent his days managing estate matters, tenant disputes, and correspondence with distant business partners, often not returning until well after dark. Alira, meanwhile, found small ways to fill her days, reading in the library, walking the extensive gardens, and slowly earning the quiet trust of the household staff through simple acts of kindness. She learned that young Nora, the kitchen maid, had a little sister living in a nearby orphanage, and Alira began setting aside small treats from her own meals to send along whenever Nora visited home. She noticed that old Edmund Cole, despite his stern manner, walked with a slight limp that clearly pained him on cold mornings, and she quietly arranged, through written notes to Mrs. Whitfield, for warmer blankets to be placed in his quarters. These small gestures did not go unnoticed among the staff, who slowly began to warm toward their silent new Duchess, whispering among themselves that perhaps this strange marriage was not such a tragedy after all, even if the Duke himself remained largely unaware of his wife's quiet goodness. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens, Alira discovered a small stone building tucked behind an overgrown hedge, half hidden and clearly forgotten. Inside, she found several children, dressed in patched clothing, sitting on wooden benches, while an elderly caretaker taught them their letters from a worn book. Nora, who had accompanied her that day, explained quietly, "His Grace allows a small number of orphan children from the village to study here, though he rarely visits himself. He arranged it quietly, some years back, and pays for their lessons and meals, though he asks that it never be spoken of widely." Alira watched the children for a long moment, something warm stirring in her chest. This cold, guarded Duke, who had married her specifically to avoid any warmth or affection, was secretly providing shelter and education to orphan children just like herself. It was the first true glimpse she had caught of the good heart hidden beneath his icy exterior, exactly as his grandmother had described. That evening, at dinner, Alira found herself studying Alistair with new curiosity, wondering about the layers of contradiction within him. He noticed her gaze eventually, and raised an eyebrow slightly. "Something troubles you?" he asked, his tone still formal, but not entirely unkind. Alira shook her head gently, then hesitated, before reaching for the small notepad she now carried with her at meals for such moments. She wrote quickly, then slid the paper across the table toward him. I visited the schoolhouse in the garden today. The children seem happy. Alistair's expression shifted, something like surprise flickering across his features, before he carefully smoothed it away. You found that place, he said quietly. It was not quite a question. Elira nodded, watching him carefully. It is nothing, he said, looking away toward the window. A small arrangement, nothing more. But Elira had seen enough in that brief moment of surprise to understand that this small kindness meant far more to him than he wished to admit, and something in her chest tightened with a feeling she could not yet name, though it felt remarkably close to tenderness. As the fire crackled softly beside them and the long dining table stretched silent between their two chairs, neither Alistair nor Elira spoke another word that evening. Yet something had shifted, however slightly, in the quiet space between them. A small crack forming in the cold wall the Duke had built so carefully around his guarded heart, though neither of them yet understood just how wide that crack would eventually grow. Winter deepened over the following weeks, blanketing Renfield Hall in heavy snow that made the eastern farm roads nearly impossible to travel. Alistair, forced to remain closer to the house more often than he wished, found himself crossing paths with Elira more frequently throughout each day, in the library, in the long gallery hallway, in the quiet moments before and after meals. He told himself these encounters meant nothing, that he was simply adjusting to the practical reality of sharing a house with another person. Yet he began noticing small details about her that unsettled his careful indifference. The way she always saved a portion of her bread to share with the stable dogs, the gentle patience she showed when old Edmund Cole struggled with his ledgers, quietly writing suggestions on paper without ever making him feel foolish. The soft, thoughtful way she watched the snow fall outside the library windows, as though finding quiet wonder in something so simple. One particularly cold evening, Alistair returned from a difficult day dealing with a collapsed barn roof on one of the tenant farms, his mood dark and his temper thin. He stormed into the study, intending to drown his frustration in paperwork, only to find a small fire already crackling warmly in the hearth, and a cup of hot tea waiting on his desk, though he had told no one of his plans to work late that evening. Confused, he glanced up to find Elira standing quietly near the doorway, having clearly arranged for the fire and tea herself before slipping away unnoticed. She offered a small, hesitant smile, unsure of how her simple gesture would be received. For a long moment, Alistair simply stared at her, something complicated moving behind his tired eyes. Then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he said, "Thank you." It was the first time he had spoken those words to her since their wedding day, and something in Elira's chest warmed at the simple kindness in his tired voice. She nodded once, then turned to leave him to his work, though she carried the small victory of that moment with her long after she had gone. Alistair sat alone in his study long after she had left, staring into the fire, his mind troubled by thoughts he did not wish to examine too closely. He had married this woman specifically to avoid any risk of affection, to protect the careful walls he had built around his heart after Clarissa's betrayal. Yet here he sat, oddly comforted by a cup of tea and a quiet smile from a wife who asked nothing of him in return. He told himself firmly that this meant nothing, that gratitude for simple kindness was not the same as the dangerous, foolish thing called love. Yet even as he repeated these reassurances to himself, some small, stubborn part of his guarded heart had already begun, ever so slightly, to soften toward the silent orphan girl he had chosen, specifically because he believed she could never touch it at all. Outside, the snow continued falling silently over Renfield Hall, blanketing the estate in white, while inside its walls, two people who had entered marriage as strangers were slowly, unknowingly, beginning to change one another in ways neither of them yet understood, nor were prepared to face. A crash of thunder shook the windows of Renfield Hall, and Alistair sat bolt upright in his bed, his heart pounding, as though he had just run for miles. The dream had returned again, the same dream that had haunted him for 3 years. Clarissa's laughing face, turning cruel the moment she saw him watching, her voice sharp and mocking as she slipped her hand from his and walked away forever. He pressed his palms against his eyes, willing the memory to fade, but it clung to him stubbornly in the darkness. He rose and walked to the window, watching lightning flash across the snow-covered grounds. Sleep would not return easily tonight, he knew from long experience. He pulled on a robe and made his way downstairs, intending to lose himself in paperwork until exhaustion finally claimed him. Passing the library, he noticed a soft light beneath the door and paused. Curious despite himself, he pushed it open quietly and found Alira curled in a large armchair near the dying fire, a thick book open on her lap, though her eyes had drifted closed in sleep. A single candle flickered on the small table beside her, nearly burned down to nothing. For a long moment, Alistair simply stood in the doorway, watching her. In sleep, her face lost the careful composure she wore during her waking hours, and something younger, softer, more vulnerable showed through. He found himself thinking, unwillingly, that she looked almost peaceful, almost happy, here among the books she so clearly loved. He should have woken her gently and sent her to her own chambers. Instead, he crossed the room quietly and eased the book from her loose fingers, marking her page with a slip of ribbon before setting it aside. He reached for a blanket folded over the back of a nearby chair and draped it carefully over her shoulders, taking great care not to wake her. As he straightened, Alira stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. For a brief, unguarded moment, their eyes met in the candlelight, and neither of them looked away. Something passed between them in that silence, wordless and uncertain, before Alistair cleared his throat and stepped back. "You fell asleep reading," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You should return to your chambers before you catch a chill." Alira nodded slowly, still half caught between sleep and waking, and reached for her notepad on the table beside her. She wrote quickly, then held it up for him to read. Could not sleep either. The storm was too loud. Alistair almost smiled at that, a strange, unfamiliar pull at the corner of his mouth that he quickly suppressed. "Nor could I," he admitted, surprising himself with his own honesty. They stood together a moment longer in the quiet library, the storm still rumbling faintly outside, neither quite ready to end this strange, unplanned moment of closeness. Finally, Alistair gestured toward the door. "Come," he said. "I will walk you back." They walked together through the dark hallways, Alira carrying her candle, Alistair matching his pace carefully to hers. Neither spoke, for there was nothing that needed saying, yet the silence between them felt different now than it had on their wedding day, warmer somehow, less like a wall and more like a shared shelter against the storm outside. At her door, Alira paused and turned to face him, her eyes searching his face in the flickering candlelight. She reached out, hesitant, and touched his arm lightly, a small gesture of gratitude that carried more warmth than words might have managed. Alistair looked down at her hand on his sleeve, something tightening in his chest that he refused to examine too closely. "Good night, Alira," he said quietly, using her name for what felt like the first time with any real tenderness in his voice. She smiled, small and genuine, before slipping into her chambers and closing the door softly behind her. Alistair remained standing in the hallway a moment longer, staring at the closed door, his heart beating strangely fast for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm still raging outside. He returned to his own chambers, troubled by the unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he recognized with growing unease as something dangerously close to the affection he had sworn never to allow himself again. He told himself firmly, as he had told himself many times before, that this was merely kindness, merely the natural result of two people sharing a house and growing accustomed to one another's presence, nothing more. Yet sleep, when it finally came, brought no dreams of Clarissa that night, only the quiet memory of candlelight and a small, gentle hand resting briefly against his arm. The following days brought a subtle shift in the rhythm of Renfield Hall. Alistair found himself lingering longer at breakfast, making small observations about the weather or the estate that required no response beyond Alira's attentive nod. He began taking his afternoon tea in the drawing room rather than his study, claiming the light was better for reading there, though everyone in the household, from Mrs. Whitfield down to young Nora, understood the true reason without needing to be told. Alira, for her part, found herself watching for these small moments with a quiet eagerness she had not expected to feel. She began leaving small notes for him around the house, observations about the garden birds returning early despite the cold, or a particularly clever remark overheard from young Peter at the schoolhouse. Simple things meant only to bring a small smile to his tired face. One afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield found Alira in the sitting room, carefully mending a small tear in one of Alistair's old riding coats, her needle moving with practiced patience. The housekeeper paused in the doorway, watching the quiet scene with a soft smile of her own. "You are good for him, you know," Mrs. Whitfield said gently, stepping into the room. "I have served this family for 30 years, and I have never seen His Grace so at ease as he has been these past weeks." Elira looked up, surprised, and shook her head modestly, though warmth colored her cheeks at the housekeeper's words. "It is true," Mrs. Whitfield insisted. "He lost so much when that vain woman broke his heart, more than most people ever knew. He was a different man before her, warmer, quicker to laugh. I had begun to think that man was gone forever." She paused, studying Elira thoughtfully. "But I see glimpses of him again now, when he is with you." Elira set aside her mending, considering the housekeeper's words carefully. She had come to Renfield Hall expecting nothing beyond a roof over her head and safety from the uncertain future the workhouse offered. She had not expected to find herself caring, quite genuinely, for the cold, guarded man she had married. Nor had she expected the strange, fragile hope now blooming in her own chest that perhaps this marriage might become something more than mere convenience after all. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Elira sat before her small writing desk and allowed herself, for the first time in many years, to hum softly under her breath, the old familiar melody her mother had once sung to her so long ago. She had kept this small piece of her past locked away carefully, afraid that sharing it, even with herself, might break something fragile inside her heart. But tonight, in the quiet safety of her new home, the melody slipped free, almost without her permission, filling the small room with its gentle, wordless comfort. She did not know that the sound, faint as it was, carried further than she realized, drifting down the quiet hallway toward a study, where a certain duke sat working late into the night, his pen pausing mid-sentence as an unfamiliar, haunting melody reached his ears, pulling him slowly, almost against his will, up from his chair and toward the sound he could not yet identify. Alistair's pen fell still against the paper, his breath catching in his throat. The sound drifting through the hallway was faint, almost too soft to trust, yet unmistakably a voice, humming a slow, tender melody that seemed to rise and fall like a lullaby meant for a sleeping child. His mind raced immediately to impossible explanations. A maid singing quietly to herself, a sound carried strangely from the village below. Anything but the truth his heart already suspected, because the truth felt impossible. He rose from his desk and walked quietly into the hallway, following the fragile thread of sound past the closed doors of sleeping servants, past the portrait gallery where his ancestors watched in silent judgment, until he stood outside Elira's chamber door, his hand raised but not yet knocking. The melody continued softly from within, gentle and unpracticed, clearly not meant for any audience at all. Alistair stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding with a confusion he could not name. His wife, the silent orphan he had married specifically because she could not speak, was humming, quite clearly, quite beautifully, on the other side of that door. He should have walked away. Every instinct of propriety told him to retreat quietly and never mention what he had heard. Yet his feet remained rooted to the spot, and slowly, without quite deciding to do so, he pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Elira sat at her small writing desk, her back to the door, unaware of his presence, humming softly to herself as she brushed out her long hair before bed. The melody was simple, repetitive, clearly a fragment of memory rather than a complete song, yet it carried such tenderness, such quiet longing, that Alistair felt something crack open in his chest that he had kept sealed shut for 3 long years. A floorboard creaked beneath his weight, and Elira's humming stopped abruptly. She turned, startled, her eyes widening in alarm as she saw him standing in her doorway, witness to the secret she had guarded so carefully. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. Elira's hand rose instinctively to her throat, as though she could somehow take back the sound that had already escaped into the air between them. Fear flickered across her face. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of what this discovery might mean. Whether he would think her deceptive, whether he would be angry that she had kept such a secret from him. "You can hum," Alistair said quietly, his voice thick with something between confusion and wonder. "All this time, I believed you entirely without voice, yet you can hum." Elira looked down, her cheeks coloring with something like shame, and reached quickly for her notepad, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote. "I lost the words, not all the sound. A fever took my speech when I was a child, but somehow the humming remained. I did not think it mattered. I did not think anyone needed to know. Alistair stepped further into the room, his earlier anger at the deception, if it could even be called that, already fading into something far more complicated. Where did you learn that melody? He asked gently. It sounded like a lullaby. Elira's eyes grew distant, and she hesitated a long moment before writing her answer. My mother sang it to me before she died. I do not remember her face clearly anymore, nor much of her voice, but I remember this melody. It is the only piece of her I have left. I hum it sometimes when I am alone, to remember she existed, that I was loved once, before everything was taken from me. Alistair read the words twice, something tightening painfully in his chest. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the true depth of loss this quiet, gentle woman carried within her, a loss not so different from his own, though hers had come far earlier and far more cruelly. I am sorry, he said softly, surprising himself with the sincerity in his own voice. I did not know. Elira looked up at him, searching his face carefully, as though trying to determine whether his sympathy was genuine or merely polite obligation. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because some of the tension eased from her shoulders, and she offered him a small, uncertain smile. Alistair remained a moment longer, unsure of what more to say, his usual careful composure entirely abandoned in the face of this unexpected intimacy. Finally, he cleared his throat and stepped back toward the door. Good night, Elira, he said, his voice gentler than he had ever used with her before. Thank you for trusting me enough to let me hear it, even by accident. He left her chambers that night, with his mind spinning, unable to settle back into his paperwork, unable to find sleep either. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of his own bedroom, the memory of that fragile melody echoing in his thoughts long after the house had fallen silent around him. He found himself wondering, with a discomfort he did not welcome, whether Clarissa Vane, in all her beauty and clever words, had ever once shown him anything as honest, as unguarded, as the small, humming secret Elira had just revealed to him. The comparison unsettled him deeply, because he already suspected, somewhere in the quiet corners of his heart, what the honest answer would be. The next morning, Alistair found himself watching Elira across the breakfast table, with new eyes, no longer simply the convenient, silent bride he had chosen to protect himself from love, but a woman carrying her own private grief, her own carefully guarded heart, not so different from his in shape, even if the wounds that formed it had come from a different direction entirely. Elira, he said suddenly, breaking the usual morning silence between them. She looked up, surprised, her eyes questioning. Would you hum for me again sometime? He asked, the request feeling strange and vulnerable on his tongue, unlike anything he had asked of another person in years. Not by accident this time, if you wish to. A slow, genuine smile spread across Elira's face, warm and surprised, and she nodded, her eyes shining with an emotion that looked remarkably like hope. Something shifted between them in that quiet moment, a small but significant step away from the cold marriage of convenience they had begun, and toward something neither of them had expected to find, nor were entirely certain yet how to name. Outside, the winter sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, spilling golden light across the frosted gardens of Renfield Hall, as though even the weather sensed the quiet thaw beginning within its ancient walls. A messenger arrived at Renfield Hall at first light, his horse lathered with sweat despite the winter cold, carrying urgent news that sent the entire household into sudden motion. Duchess Beatrice had taken a turn for the worse in the night. Her old physician, Dr. Hale, feared she might not last through the week. Alistair read the note twice, his face draining of color, before rushing upstairs, without even pausing to finish dressing properly. Elira followed close behind, her own heart heavy with worry, for the elderly Duchess had shown her nothing but warmth and honesty since her arrival at Renfield Hall. She found Alistair standing frozen just outside his grandmother's chamber door, his hand pressed flat against the wood, unable to bring himself to enter. I do not know how to say goodbye to her, he admitted quietly, his voice raw, in a way Elira had never heard from him before. She raised me after my parents died. She is the only person who never once looked at me and saw only the title, only the estate, and now I am about to lose her too. Elira reached out and took his hand gently, offering silent comfort in the only way she could. Alistair looked down at their joined hands, something breaking loose in his chest, and for the first time since their strange marriage began, He did not pull away from the comfort she offered. Together, they entered the Duchess's chamber. Dr. Hale stood near the window, his expression grave, while Beatrice lay propped against her pillows, pale and frail, though her eyes remained sharp when they landed on the two figures entering together, hand in hand. "Ah," the old woman rasped, a faint smile touching her lips. "There you both are. Come closer. I have not much strength left for shouting across rooms." Alistair moved quickly to her bedside, kneeling beside the bed and taking her thin hand carefully in both of his. "Grandmother, you must not speak of leaving us. Dr. Hale will find a way to—" "Hush, boy," Beatrice interrupted, though her tone held no real sharpness, only tired affection. "I have lived a long life, and I am not afraid of what comes next. I only wish to see you settled and cared for before I go, and I believe, finally, that I have." Her gaze shifted to Elira, standing quietly at the foot of the bed, and softened further. "You have done well for him, child, better than I dared hope when he first told me of his foolish plan to marry a silent bride. I see the change in his eyes when he looks at you now. That is a gift greater than any fortune this family holds." Elira's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped closer, taking the Duchess's other hand gently in her own. Beatrice's gaze moved back to Alistair, growing more serious now. "There is something you must know, my boy, before I go. Something concerning the estate's future, and concerning her." She nodded toward Elira. "My will contains a condition, arranged long before you ever met this girl, though it now suits my purposes far better than I could have planned. The full inheritance of Renfield Hall and its lands passes to you only if your marriage remains intact and unquestioned for a full year's time. I added that clause after Clarissa's betrayal, to protect you from ever rushing into another foolish arrangement out of grief or anger." Alistair frowned, confused. "Grandmother, why tell me this now?" "Because," Beatrice said, her voice weakening further, "Clarissa Vane has returned to the county. I received word only yesterday, before I fell ill again. She has heard of your marriage, and I fear, knowing her nature as I do, that she will not simply let the matter rest quietly. She was always ambitious, that girl, and your fortune was never far from her calculations." A cold weight settled in Alistair's stomach at the mention of Clarissa's name, old wounds threatening to reopen despite the warmth that had been slowly growing in his heart these past weeks. He glanced instinctively at Elira, who stood very still, her expression carefully composed, though he could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. "She will find nothing to threaten here," Alistair said firmly, though even as he spoke the words, uncertainty gnawed at him. "My marriage is settled. Elira is my wife."
"Good,"
Beatrice whispered, her eyes growing heavy with exhaustion. "Protect her, Alistair. Protect what you are building here, even if you have not yet found the courage to name it properly for what it is." Her eyes closed then, not in death, but in deep, exhausted sleep, and Dr. Hale gently ushered them from the room, promising to send word immediately should her condition worsen further through the night. Alistair and Elira walked together in heavy silence back toward the main hall, the weight of the Duchess's warning settling over both of them like a cold shadow. Alistair's jaw was tight with old anger and new worry, memories of Clarissa's cruel departure resurfacing with unwelcome clarity. That evening, dinner passed in troubled silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, as the servants cleared the final course, Alistair spoke, his voice low and careful. "You must not worry about Clarissa," he said, though the words seemed meant as much for himself as for Elira. "Whatever games she wishes to play, they will not succeed here. Our marriage is legal and binding, and I will not allow her to threaten what we have built these past weeks." Elira reached for her notepad, her expression thoughtful as she wrote her response. "I am not afraid for myself. I am afraid for you. She hurt you once so deeply. I do not wish to see that wound reopened." Alistair read her words slowly, something warm and aching moving through his chest at the simple, selfless concern behind them. He reached across the table and, for the first time since their wedding day, took her hand deliberately in his own, holding it gently. "You need not fear for me," he said softly. "Whatever Clarissa once broke in me, you have been quietly mending these past weeks, piece by piece, without even realizing you were doing it. I will not let her undo that work now." Elira's eyes shone with unshed tears at his words, and she squeezed his hand gently in return, a silent promise passing between them that needed no spoken words at all. Yet even as they sat together that evening, drawing quiet strength from one another against whatever threat approached, neither of them could fully shake the unease that had settled over Renfield Hall since the messenger's arrival that morning. Somewhere beyond the estate's frosted gardens, a familiar danger was stirring once more, patient and calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike at the fragile happiness they had only just begun to build. A single bell tolled slowly across the frozen grounds of Renfield Hall, before dawn, its heavy sound carrying through every corridor of the great house, like a mournful warning. Alistair sat up instantly, his heart already sinking with dread, before Mrs. Whitfield even knocked upon his door, her face streaked with tears as she delivered the news he had feared since the messenger's arrival days earlier. Duchess Beatrice had passed peacefully in her sleep during the night, Dr. Hale reported, without pain or struggle, her hand still resting where a maid had gently folded it across her chest. Alistair received the news in stunned silence, his mind refusing at first to fully accept that the one person who had raised him, guided him, and loved him unconditionally since childhood, was now gone forever. Elira found him an hour later, sitting alone in his grandmother's now empty chamber, staring blankly at the chair where Beatrice had spent so many of her final days. She did not speak, of course, but she crossed the room quietly and sat beside him, taking his hand in silent companionship, offering the only comfort she knew how to give. "She was the last person who truly knew me," Alistair said quietly, his voice hollow with grief. "Before the title, before the estate, before Clarissa broke whatever softness remained in me, she saw all of it, every version of who I was, and she loved me anyway." Elira squeezed his hand gently, and after a long moment, Alistair turned to look at her properly, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "She loved you too, in the short time she knew you. She told me, before the end, that you had already begun to heal something in me she feared was broken forever." The funeral took place 3 days later, a solemn gathering of family friends, distant relatives, and loyal estate workers, who had served the Duchess faithfully for decades. Elira stood beside Alistair throughout the entire ceremony, her presence a quiet, steady anchor, as he accepted condolences and endured the heavy formality of a nobleman's farewell to a woman who had been so much more to him than mere family obligation. Afterward, in the privacy of his study, Mr. Pruitt arrived to formally read the terms of the Duchess's will, as tradition required. Alistair sat stiffly behind his desk, Elira seated quietly beside him, while the lawyer unfolded the official documents with careful, practiced hands. "The bulk of the estate passes to you, Your Grace, as expected," Mr. Pruitt began, adjusting his spectacles. "However, as the late Duchess mentioned to you personally, there remains the marriage condition she established some years ago, following the unfortunate events with Miss Vane. The full and unrestricted inheritance of Renfield Hall, its lands, and its considerable fortune, requires that your current marriage remain valid and unchallenged for a period of 1 full year from the wedding date. Should the marriage be dissolved, annulled, or otherwise invalidated before that year is complete, the estate passes instead to a distant cousin, a Mr. Reginald Ashcombe, currently residing in the northern counties." Alistair frowned, though the news itself was not entirely unexpected, given his grandmother's earlier warning. "The marriage is entirely valid, Pruitt. There is no cause for concern on that account." "Of course, Your Grace," Mr. Pruitt agreed, though something hesitant lingered in his tone. "However, I feel obligated to mention, given recent developments, that Miss Vane has apparently taken up residence again at her family's estate nearby, and has been making certain inquiries regarding the exact terms of your marriage and this very inheritance clause. I do not wish to alarm you unnecessarily, but given her history, caution seems prudent." A cold weight settled once more in Alistair's chest at the confirmation of what his grandmother had already warned him about. Beside him, he felt Elira grow very still, her hand tightening slightly where it rested near his own on the desk. "Let her inquire all she wishes," Alistair said finally, his voice hardening with resolve. "She will find nothing to exploit here. My marriage to Elira is genuine, recognized by law, blessed by my own grandmother before her passing, and I intend to see it honored fully, regardless of whatever schemes Clarissa Vane imagines she might attempt." Mr. Pruitt nodded, gathering his papers with evident relief at the Duke's firm resolve. "Very good, Your Grace. I shall ensure all documentation regarding your marriage remains in perfect order, ready to withstand any challenge that might arise. After the lawyer departed, Alistair remained seated at his desk for a long while, troubled thoughts weighing heavily upon him, despite his confident words moments earlier. Elira watched him carefully, then reached for her notepad, writing slowly, before sliding the paper toward him. Are you afraid she will try to take Renfield Hall from you? Or are you afraid of seeing her again? Alistair read the question twice, appreciating, not for the first time, how perceptively his quiet wife understood him, often better than he understood himself. He considered his answer carefully before responding. Though I find, surprisingly, that the fear of losing the estate troubles me far less than I would have expected. What troubles me more is the fear that seeing her again might somehow undo the progress we have made together these past weeks. That old wounds might reopen and poison what we are building now. Elira reached across the desk and took his hand firmly in both of hers, her eyes steady and reassuring as she met his gaze directly. She could not speak the words aloud, but her expression carried them clearly enough. I am not going anywhere. Whatever she brings, we will face it together. Alistair studied her face for a long moment, something settling and strengthening within his chest at the quiet strength she offered so freely, without ever asking anything in return. Slowly, he lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss against her knuckles, a small gesture of gratitude and growing affection that surprised them both with its tenderness. Thank you, he said softly, for standing beside me through all of this. I did not expect, when I chose you specifically to avoid such closeness, that I would come to value your presence so deeply, nor so quickly. Elira's cheeks colored warmly at his words, and she smiled, small and genuine, before gently withdrawing her hand to write one final note. Perhaps some things cannot be avoided, no matter how carefully we plan against them. Alistair read her words, and, for the first time since his grandmother's death, allowed himself a small, genuine smile in return. Yet even as warmth passed quietly between them in the fading afternoon light, both understood, without needing to speak it aloud, that the true test of their fragile, growing bond had not yet arrived. Somewhere beyond the frosted hedges of Renfield Hall, Clarissa Vane was already setting her careful schemes into motion, patient and calculating as ever, preparing to challenge everything Alistair and Elira had built together in the quiet weeks since their unlikely wedding. A carriage rolled up the long drive of Renfield Hall late one afternoon, uninvited and unannounced, its fine black lacquer gleaming despite the muddy roads. Edmund Cole hurried out to intercept the unexpected visitor, his expression tightening the moment he recognized the elegant woman who stepped down, wrapped in furs far too fine for a simple social call. Miss Vane, he said stiffly, blocking her path toward the entrance. I do not believe His Grace is expecting visitors today. Clarissa smiled, a practiced, dazzling expression that had once made Alistair's heart race with foolish devotion, though it now struck the steward as calculated and cold. Nonsense, Edmund. Surely an old family friend requires no formal invitation. I have only just returned to the county, and wish to offer my condolences regarding dear Duchess Beatrice. Such tragic news. Before Edmund could protest further, the front door opened, and Alistair himself appeared, having heard the commotion from his study window. His expression hardened instantly at the sight of her, old memories flooding back with unwelcome force, though he forced his voice to remain steady and cool. Clarissa, he said flatly, this is unexpected. Alistair, she replied warmly, stepping past Edmund with practiced grace. I heard the sad news of your grandmother, and simply had to come pay my respects in person. We were close once, were we not, before circumstances separated us? Circumstances did not separate us, Alistair said, his voice cooling further. You chose to leave, quite deliberately, for another man's fortune, 3 days before our own wedding. A flicker of irritation crossed Clarissa's beautiful features before she smoothed it away with practiced ease. That was a difficult time for both of us, I admit. But surely enough years have passed that we might set aside old grievances. I heard you have remarried, rather suddenly. An orphan, I understand, from the workhouse. Something protective flared sharply in Alistair's chest at the dismissive tone in her voice. My wife's name is Elira, he said firmly, and she is more genuine in her silence than you ever were with all your pretty words. Clarissa's smile faltered only briefly before returning. Sharper now, more calculating. How romantic, she said, though her tone suggested she found nothing romantic about the arrangement at all. Perhaps I might meet this remarkable woman myself, since we are now, in some strange fashion, connected through your family. Before Alistair could refuse, the front door opened again, and Alira stepped out, having heard voices and grown curious about the unexpected visitor. She paused at the sight of the elegant stranger, some instinct immediately warning her that this was the woman responsible for the old wounds she had glimpsed occasionally beneath Alistair's careful composure. "Ah," Clarissa said, turning her full attention toward Alira, studying her with cool, assessing eyes. "So this is the silent bride. How very unconventional of you, Alistair, to choose someone so different from what one might expect of a duchess." Alira met her gaze steadily, refusing to shrink beneath the woman's obvious condescension, though she said nothing, of course, unable to defend herself with words even had she wished to attempt it. "She cannot speak," Clarissa continued, addressing Alistair directly now, as though Alira herself were not standing right there listening. "How curious that you chose precisely the sort of bride who could never challenge you, never argue with you, never truly know you at all. Tell me, Alistair, is that not simply another form of loneliness, dressed up as marriage?" Alistair's jaw tightened dangerously, and he stepped closer to Alira, placing himself protectively at her side. "You mistake silence for emptiness, Clarissa, which perhaps explains why you never understood real depth in anyone, myself included. Alira knows me better after a few short weeks than you managed to learn in the 2 years we courted." Clarissa's composure cracked visibly at the sharp rebuke, her eyes flashing with old resentment. "We shall see how well this arrangement suits you, once the novelty fades," she said coldly. "Silent brides make convenient wives, Alistair. But convenience rarely sustains a marriage through real difficulty. I give this charade 6 months before you come to regret your hasty choice." "You are not welcome here," Alistair said firmly, his voice leaving no room for further argument. "I would ask you to leave and not return uninvited again." Clarissa's expression shifted once more, calculating rather than wounded now, and she offered a small, knowing smile that sent an uneasy chill through both Alistair and Alira. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I shall leave you both to your unusual happiness, though I suspect our paths shall cross again before too long, Alistair. This county is not so very large, after all, and matters concerning inheritance and legitimacy have a curious way of demanding public attention, sooner or later." With that final, pointed remark, she turned and swept back toward her carriage, leaving Alistair and Alira standing together on the front steps, the winter wind cutting sharply between them as the carriage rolled away down the long drive. "She means to cause trouble," Alistair said quietly, once the carriage had disappeared from view. "That final remark about inheritance and legitimacy, she knows something of my grandmother's will, or suspects enough to threaten us with it." Alira reached for his hand, her expression steady despite the obvious worry in her eyes, and together they returned inside, the warmth of the great house a small comfort against the cold threat that had just arrived, uninvited, at their door. That evening, Alistair sent an urgent message to Mr. Pruitt, requesting he review every detail of their marriage documentation once more, ensuring nothing could be legally challenged or questioned. Yet even as he took these careful precautions, a deeper unease gnawed at him, one that had nothing to do with legal technicalities, and everything to do with the cruel accuracy of Clarissa's earlier words. Silence, she had suggested, might simply be another form of loneliness. Alistair sat alone in his study, long after Alira had retired for the night, turning the poisonous thought over and over in his mind, wondering, despite everything they had built together these past weeks, whether some hidden part of him still doubted that a marriage built on silence could ever truly become something real, something lasting, something worthy of the word love. Mr. Pruitt arrived at Renfield Hall in visible distress, his usually composed expression tight with worry, as he was shown quickly into Alistair's study. Alira, sensing trouble, followed close behind, taking her usual seat beside her husband's desk, as the lawyer laid out a folder of papers with trembling hands. "Your Grace, I fear Miss Vane has moved faster than we anticipated," Mr. Pruitt began, his voice grave. "She has filed a formal inquiry with the county magistrate, questioning the legitimacy of your marriage, on the grounds that your wife's origins cannot be properly verified. She claims, without any true evidence beyond rumor and speculation, that Elira may in fact be legally still bound to some prior arrangement from her time at the workhouse, or worse, that her identity itself cannot be sufficiently proven for a legal marriage to stand. Alistair's face darkened with fury. That is absurd. Mrs. Holt herself can testify to Elira's history at the workhouse, and our marriage was performed properly, with witnesses, by Father Whitmore himself. I have no doubt the challenge will ultimately fail. Mr. Pruitt agreed quickly. But such inquiries, once filed, cannot simply be ignored. The magistrate is obligated to investigate the claim formally, which means a public hearing, testimony, and unfortunately, considerable public attention and scandal in the meantime. Miss Vane clearly understands that even an unsuccessful challenge can cause significant damage, both to your reputation and to the timeline required by your grandmother's will. Elira's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her notepad, her expression tightening with worry as she absorbed the full weight of the threat now facing them. She wrote quickly, sliding the paper toward Alistair. This is my fault. If I had never come here, you would not face this trouble now. Alistair read her words and immediately shook his head, taking her hand firmly in his own. No, he said, his voice fierce with conviction. This is not your fault, Elira. This is Clarissa's doing, born entirely of her own bitterness and greed. You have done nothing wrong except exist, except be kind, except make me happier than I believed possible after everything she took from me. I will not let her punish you for that. Mr. Pruitt cleared his throat gently. There is more, Your Grace, that you should know before the hearing proceeds. Miss Vane has apparently been making inquiries in the village as well, spreading rumors among the townspeople that question not only the legal legitimacy of your marriage, but the moral character of taking a workhouse orphan as duchess at all. Some of the more traditional families in the county have expressed concern that Elira's background makes her unsuitable to represent the Renfield name in society. A cold fury settled over Alistair at this news, far sharper than his anger regarding the legal technicalities alone. She attacks Elira's character now, not simply the paperwork, he said grimly. This has become personal cruelty, dressed up as legal concern. I fear so, Your Grace, Mr. Pruitt agreed. The hearing has been scheduled for 1 week from today, at the county courthouse, open to public attendance. I would advise careful preparation, testimony from reliable witnesses, and perhaps, if I may suggest it, some public demonstration of your confidence in the marriage's legitimacy before that date arrives, to counter the damage already spreading through rumor and gossip. After the lawyer departed, Alistair sat in heavy silence, his mind working through the difficult days ahead. Elira watched him carefully, her own worry evident despite her attempts to remain composed for his sake. I will not let her win this, Alistair said finally, his voice hardening with resolve. Whatever public demonstration is required, whatever testimony must be gathered, I will do it. Renfield Hall has hosted a winter gathering for the county nobility every year since my grandfather's time, a tradition my grandmother continued faithfully until her illness prevented it these past 2 years. I intend to revive that gathering now, before the hearing, and present you properly to society as my duchess, publicly and without apology. Elira's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and determination at the suggestion, and she reached for her notepad once more. Will they accept me? I cannot speak for myself, cannot defend my own character with words the way she can with her clever tongue. Alistair took her hand gently, meeting her eyes with quiet, fierce sincerity. You do not need clever words, Elira. You need only be exactly who you already are, kind, honest, and genuine. Qualities Clarissa Vane has never possessed, despite all her practiced charm. I will stand beside you throughout the entire evening, and I will make certain every person present understands precisely how much I value you, both as my wife and as the woman who has quietly healed wounds I believed permanent. Over the following days, Renfield Hall buzzed with careful preparation for the revived winter gathering. Mrs. Whitfield oversaw the household staff in polishing silver and preparing the great hall for its first grand event in years, while invitations were dispatched swiftly to every notable family in the county, ensuring word of the gathering would reach even those already influenced by Clarissa's cruel rumors. Elira threw herself into the preparations as well, finding a sense of purpose in the careful planning, though anxiety about the coming evening never fully left her thoughts. Late one evening, As she reviewed seating arrangements with Mrs. Whitfield in the drawing room, young Nora entered quietly, her expression troubled. "Your Grace," Nora said hesitantly, addressing Illyra with the proper title she had recently begun using, with growing confidence. "I overheard something in the village today that I thought you should know. Miss Vane has been telling people that you were not merely mute from illness, but that you were placed in the workhouse originally, due to some scandal in your family, something shameful that His Grace's grandmother would never have approved had she known the full truth before her passing." Illyra's face paled at this news, old, buried fears from her childhood, stirring uncomfortably at the suggestion. She had never known the full truth of why she came to be at the workhouse so young, her earliest memories fragmented and unclear, and Clarissa's poisonous rumor struck uncomfortably close to uncertainties Illyra herself had never fully resolved. That night, unable to sleep, Illyra found herself once more in the forgotten nursery room, running her fingers over the old rocking horse, seeking some fragile comfort among the dusty relics of a childhood not her own. She did not hear Alistair enter until he spoke softly from the doorway. "I thought I might find you here," he said gently, crossing the room to sit beside her on the dusty floor, heedless of his fine clothing. "Nora told me what you overheard tonight. I want you to know, clearly and without doubt, that whatever happened in your past, however you came to the workhouse, changes nothing about who you are now, nor how deeply I have come to care for you these past weeks." Illyra looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and reached for her notepad with trembling hands. "I do not even know the truth myself. I have no memory before the workhouse, only fragments, a lullaby, a woman's gentle voice. Nothing certain enough to defend myself against her cruel rumors." Alistair read her words carefully, then gently took her hand in his. "Then we shall face this uncertainty together," he said firmly. "Whatever truth exists about your past, we shall seek it honestly. And whatever rumors Clarissa spreads in the meantime, we shall answer with truth and dignity, rather than fear. You are not defined by whatever happened before you came here, Illyra. You are defined by the kindness you have shown every person in this household, by the quiet courage you display even now, facing threats you did not create nor deserve." Illyra leaned gently against his shoulder, drawing strength from his steady presence, and together they sat in comfortable silence, among the forgotten toys of the old nursery, gathering courage for the difficult days that lay ahead, when both the winter gathering and the looming courthouse hearing would test everything they had built together, far more severely than anything they had yet faced. Candlelight blazed through every window of Renfield Hall as carriages lined the long drive, delivering the county's finest families to the first winter gathering held there in 2 years. Inside, Illyra stood before a tall mirror in her chambers, her hands trembling slightly, as Mrs. Whitfield adjusted the final pins in her hair, while a beautiful deep green gown, carefully chosen to complement her fair coloring, fell in elegant folds around her. "You look every inch a duchess," Mrs. Whitfield said warmly, meeting Illyra's anxious eyes in the mirror's reflection. "Whatever cruel words that vain woman has spread through the village, one look at you tonight will silence any doubt in the minds of those with sense enough to judge fairly." Illyra managed a small, grateful smile, though anxiety still churned uncomfortably in her stomach as she considered the evening ahead, facing an entire room of strangers who had already heard poisonous rumors about her character and origins, with no ability to defend herself through spoken words. A soft knock came at her door, and Alistair entered, dressed formally in dark evening clothes, his expression softening the moment he saw her. He crossed the room and took her hands gently in his own. "You are beautiful," he said simply, sincerely, "but more than that, you are strong, and tonight I intend for every person in that hall to understand precisely how fortunate I am to call you my wife." Illyra squeezed his hands gratefully, drawing courage from his steady confidence, and together, they descended the grand staircase, toward the crowded ballroom below, where the assembled guests turned as one to observe their entrance, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Alistair guided Illyra through the receiving line with practiced grace, introducing her formally to each guest, his arm never leaving hers, his manner warm and attentive, in a way that surprised many who remembered the cold, distant Duke of recent years. Illyra greeted each guest with a gracious nod and a warm smile, communicating through simple written notes when direct conversation proved necessary, her genuine kindness slowly winning over several skeptical faces throughout the early part of the evening. Yet the atmosphere shifted dramatically when Clarissa Vane arrived, uninvited, but bold enough to attend regardless, dressed in a stunning crimson gown that immediately drew every eye in the room. She swept through the crowd with practiced confidence, positioning herself strategically near the center of the ballroom, where her presence could not be ignored. "What a lovely gathering," Clarissa announced, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear clearly, her tone dripping with false admiration. Though I confess some surprise that the Duke would risk such public attention, given the rather serious questions currently being investigated regarding his marriage's validity. A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the nearby crowd, and Alistair felt Alira stiffen beside him, though she maintained her composure admirably despite the public provocation. He guided her firmly toward Clarissa, refusing to allow the confrontation to unfold through whispered gossip rather than direct address. "Clarissa," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly attentive room, "if you have concerns regarding my marriage, I would suggest raising them properly through the magistrate's hearing, already scheduled, rather than disrupting a social gathering with baseless insinuation." "Baseless?" Clarissa repeated, arching an elegant eyebrow, as several nearby guests leaned in to listen more closely. "I merely raise reasonable questions any concerned citizen might ask. Your Duchess cannot speak for herself, cannot verify her own history, cannot even confirm her true identity, beyond whatever the workhouse matron chose to tell you. Is it truly so unreasonable to question whether such a marriage serves the best interests of this county's oldest and most respected family?" Alistair's jaw tightened dangerously, but before he could respond, Alira surprised everyone, including herself, by stepping forward slightly, drawing herself up to her full height, with quiet, unmistakable dignity. She could not answer Clarissa's cruel words aloud, but her steady, unflinching gaze carried its own powerful message, refusing to shrink beneath the public scrutiny, despite every disadvantage stacked against her. "My wife's character," Alistair said firmly, breaking the tense silence, "requires no defense through spoken argument, Clarissa, because it speaks clearly enough through her actions. Since her arrival at Renfield Hall, she has shown greater kindness to every member of this household, from the housekeeper to the stable boys, than you managed to demonstrate throughout our entire courtship. She has quietly supported the orphan children of this county, without seeking recognition or praise. She has shown me more genuine honesty in a few short weeks than you offered in 2 years of pretty words that ultimately proved worthless." A murmur of surprised approval rippled through the crowd at this passionate defense, several guests nodding thoughtfully, clearly reconsidering whatever doubts Clarissa's earlier rumors had planted in their minds. Clarissa's composure faltered visibly under the public rebuke, color rising sharply in her cheeks. "You would choose a mute orphan of unknown origin over a woman of proper standing and reputation?" she demanded, her carefully maintained charm slipping entirely to reveal the sharp bitterness beneath. "I already have chosen her," Alistair replied evenly, taking Alira's hand firmly in his own before the assembled crowd. "Not out of convenience, as I once believed, but because she has shown me, through quiet actions rather than clever words, what genuine partnership truly means. I would choose her again 1,000 times over, regardless of anyone's opinion of her origins." The ballroom fell into stunned silence at this bold public declaration, and Clarissa, recognizing that she had badly misjudged the evening's outcome, turned sharply and departed without another word, her crimson gown swishing furiously as she pushed through the crowd toward the exit. A moment of tense silence followed her departure, before an elderly nobleman near the front of the crowd, Lord Ashworth, a respected figure whose approval carried significant weight throughout the county, stepped forward and offered Alira a formal, respectful bow. "Well spoken, Your Grace," he said to Alistair, though his eyes remained on Alira with evident newfound respect. "I have known your family for 3 generations, and I have rarely witnessed such genuine devotion expressed so plainly. Whatever questions others may raise, I see nothing here but an honest marriage between 2 people who clearly value one another deeply." Several other guests murmured agreement, and slowly, gradually, the tense atmosphere of the ballroom eased back into something resembling normal festivity, the musicians resuming their gentle melodies as guests returned to conversation and dancing. The immediate crisis, if not entirely resolved, at least significantly weakened, by Alistair's passionate public stand. Later that evening, as the last guest departed and the great hall grew quiet once more, Alistair and Alira stood together near the tall windows, watching the final carriages disappear down the snow-covered drive. "You were magnificent tonight," Alistair said softly, turning to face her fully. "I have never been more certain of anything than I am of my feelings for you in this moment, Alira. Whatever the magistrate decides at the coming hearing, whatever schemes Clarissa continues to attempt, I want you to know clearly that this marriage stopped being mere convenience for me many weeks ago. It has become something far more precious than I ever believed myself capable of feeling again." Alira's eyes filled with grateful tears, and she reached for her notepad one final time that evening, her hand steady despite the emotion clearly moving through her. "I feel the same. Whatever happens next, I am grateful beyond words that you chose me, even if your reasons then were different from what they have become now." Alistair read her words, then gently cupped her face in his hands, his expression tender and open, in a way it had never been before their marriage began. "Then let us face whatever comes together," he said softly, "not as strangers bound by convenience, but as partners bound by something far stronger." Outside, snow began falling softly once more over Renfield Hall, gentle and quiet, much like the fragile happiness that had grown steadily between them these past weeks, now tested publicly and, for tonight at least, standing strong against every threat aimed at breaking it apart. The county courthouse was packed to capacity, every bench filled with curious spectators, eager to witness the outcome of a scandal that had consumed local gossip for an entire week. Alistair sat rigidly beside Mr. Pruitt at the front table, Alira close beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the magistrate, a stern-faced man named Judge Ferris, called the hearing to order, with a sharp rap of his gavel. This hearing concerns a formal challenge to the legitimacy of the marriage between Duke Alistair Renfield and his wife, known as Alira Renfield, formerly of the county workhouse, Judge Ferris announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom. The challenge, brought forward by Miss Clarissa Vane, questions whether the bride's true identity and history can be sufficiently verified to constitute a legally binding marriage. We shall hear testimony from all relevant parties before rendering judgment. Clarissa sat across the aisle, composed and confident despite her poor showing at the winter gathering days earlier, clearly determined to salvage her scheme through more formal legal channels. Beside her sat a lawyer Alistair did not recognize, a sharp-featured man who had apparently been retained specifically for this challenge. Mrs. Holt was called first, and she approached the witness stand with visible nervousness, clearly unaccustomed to such formal proceedings, though her testimony remained clear and steady throughout. "I have cared for Alira since she arrived at the workhouse at approximately 6 years of age," Mrs. Holt testified, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "She was brought to us by a traveling clergyman, who found her wandering alone near the northern road, unable to speak, due to what appeared to be severe illness or trauma. We never learned her family name with certainty, nor the full circumstances of how she came to be alone, but I can testify absolutely to her good character throughout the 14 years she remained in our care." Clarissa's lawyer rose for cross-examination, his tone deliberately probing. "And you cannot confirm, with any legal certainty, this young woman's true parentage, her legitimate birth, nor any details of her life before arriving at your workhouse at 6 years of age?" "I cannot," Mrs. Holt admitted honestly, "though I fail to see how that reflects poorly on her character now, given circumstances entirely beyond her control as a small child." Father Whitmore testified next, confirming the proper legal performance of the wedding ceremony itself, followed by Mr. Pruitt, who methodically walked the court through every piece of documentation supporting the marriage's legal validity. Yet Clarissa's lawyer continued pressing the same central argument throughout each testimony, that Alira's unverifiable origins created sufficient legal uncertainty to challenge the marriage's full legitimacy. Finally, Judge Ferris called for a brief recess before final arguments, and it was during this pause that an unexpected commotion arose near the courthouse entrance. An elderly woman, weathered and travel-worn, pushed her way through the crowd, insisting loudly that she carried information critical to the proceedings. Judge Ferris, intrigued despite the irregular interruption, allowed the woman forward. She introduced herself as Agnes Corwin, a former servant who had once worked at a manor house some 50 miles north, before it burned to the ground many years earlier, under tragic circumstances. I saw the notices about this hearing in the county paper, Agnes explained, her voice trembling with age and emotion. The description of the silent girl, found wandering near the northern road at 6 years of age, unable to speak due to trauma. It matches exactly a lost child from the fire at Ashford Manor, many years past. The family perished in that fire, all except a young daughter who was never found afterward, presumed lost in the flames along with her mother, though her body was never recovered. The courtroom fell utterly silent at this revelation. Alistair turned sharply to look at Alira, whose face had gone pale as parchment, her hands trembling visibly in her lap. The family, Agnes continued, her eyes fixed on Alira with growing certainty, was a respectable, well-regarded family of proper standing, though not titled nobility. The mother used to sing a particular lullaby to her daughter every night, a melody I would recognize anywhere, having heard it drift through those halls 100 times before tragedy struck. If this young woman before us knows such a melody, I believe it would confirm beyond any doubt exactly who she truly is. Judge Ferris, sensing the significance of this testimony, turned toward Alira directly. Can you hum this melody the witness describes, if indeed you know one? Alira's eyes filled with tears as she rose slowly to her feet, every eye in the crowded courtroom fixed upon her. With trembling breath, she closed her eyes and began to hum, softly at first, then with growing confidence, the same haunting, tender melody she had shared with Alistair months earlier in the quiet privacy of her chambers. Agnes Corwin gasped audibly, tears springing immediately to her own eyes. That is the melody, she confirmed, her voice breaking with emotion. That is precisely the lullaby Lady Ashford sang to her daughter every single night. I would know it anywhere, even after all these years. This young woman is Lady Eleanor Ashford, presumed lost in the fire that claimed her family, now finally found alive after all this time. A wave of astonished murmurs swept through the courtroom, and Judge Ferris rapped his gavel firmly for order, his own expression clearly moved by the unexpected revelation. This changes matters considerably, he announced. Far from being an orphan of unknown, questionable origin, this testimony suggests the Duchess is in fact the long-lost daughter of a respected, legitimate family, tragically separated from her identity through circumstances of trauma and loss entirely beyond her control or fault. Clarissa's face had drained of all color, her carefully constructed challenge crumbling entirely in the face of this unexpected revelation. Her lawyer conferred hurriedly with her, clearly recognizing that continuing the legal challenge now would only invite further public humiliation. Judge Ferris did not wait for further argument. Given this new evidence regarding the Duchess's true identity and legitimate birth, combined with the clear, proper legal documentation of the marriage ceremony itself, I find no valid grounds to challenge the legitimacy of this marriage. This hearing is concluded, and the challenge is formally dismissed. The courtroom erupted into surprised applause and excited murmurs, and Alistair rose immediately, pulling Alira, or Eleanor, as she now understood herself to truly be, into a fierce, protective embrace, both of them overwhelmed by the sudden, unexpected resolution of both their legal troubles and the mystery of her lost identity. You are Lady Eleanor Ashford, Alistair murmured against her hair, wonder and relief mixing thickly in his voice. Not merely a silent orphan I once chose out of fear, but a woman of genuine legitimate standing, finally restored to the identity that was so cruelly taken from you as a child. Alira, still trembling with the overwhelming emotion of the moment, pulled back slightly to look up at him, her eyes shining with tears of relief and joy. She reached quickly for her notepad, her hand still shaking as she wrote her response. The name matters less to me than the family I have found here with you. Whether I am called Alira or Eleanor, my heart belongs to Renfield Hall now, and to you. Alistair read her words, and felt his own eyes grow damp with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, heedless of the watching crowd, before guiding her carefully out of the courthouse, past Clarissa's stunned, defeated expression, and out into the crisp winter air, where their future finally stood clear and unthreatened before them, for the very first time since their strange marriage had begun. A sharp cry cut through the quiet of Renfield Hall in the middle of the night, pulling Alistair from sleep so suddenly that he nearly fell from the bed in his rush to reach the adjoining chamber. Months had passed since the courthouse hearing, months of steady, deepening happiness between them, and now, finally, the moment they had anticipated with equal parts joy and nervous anticipation had arrived without warning, weeks earlier than Dr. Hale had predicted. "The baby is coming," Mrs. Whitfield announced breathlessly, already directing maids to fetch hot water and clean linens as Dr. Hale hurried up the stairs behind her, his medical bag in hand. Alistair found Eleanor, as she was now formally known throughout the county, gripping the bedpost tightly, her face tight with pain, though her eyes remained remarkably calm, despite the sudden urgency of the moment. "I am here," Alistair said firmly, rushing to her side and taking her hand, though Dr. Hale quickly ushered him toward the door, insisting firmly that such matters were not suited for a husband's presence in the room itself. The following hours passed with agonizing slowness for Alistair, pacing the hallway outside, while muffled sounds of activity and occasional cries drifted through the closed door. He thought, during those long hours, of everything that had brought them to this moment, the cold, calculated marriage he had once arranged specifically to avoid love, the accidental discovery of a secret lullaby that had cracked open his carefully guarded heart, the courthouse revelation that had restored Eleanor's true identity, and finally silenced Clarissa's schemes for good. Clarissa herself had left the county entirely within weeks of the hearing's humiliating conclusion, her reputation too damaged among proper society to remain comfortably in a place where her cruel scheming had been so publicly exposed. Alistair had heard, through occasional gossip, that she had eventually married a wealthy merchant in a distant city, though he found he no longer felt anything toward her beyond distant, faded indifference, the old wound she had once caused entirely healed by the genuine love that had grown between himself and Eleanor. Finally, near dawn, Dr. Hale emerged from the chamber, his tired face breaking into a warm smile. "Congratulations, Your Grace," he said. "You have a healthy daughter, and your wife is resting comfortably, exhausted but well." Alistair rushed into the room, his heart pounding with overwhelming joy and relief. Eleanor lay propped against her pillows, exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped carefully in soft blankets. She looked up as he entered, her tired eyes shining with pure happiness, and gestured him closer with a gentle nod. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face of his newborn daughter for the first time, overwhelmed by an emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees beside the bed. "She is perfect," he whispered, reaching out carefully to touch the baby's soft cheek with one finger. Eleanor smiled and shifted slightly, making room for him to sit beside her, and together they gazed down at their daughter in comfortable, joyful silence, for a long, precious moment. Finally, Eleanor reached for the notepad that still remained on her bedside table, though these days she used it far less often than she once had, having gradually recovered fragments of speech, through patient effort, with Dr. Hale's gentle guidance over recent months. Small words at first, then simple sentences, her voice returning slowly, like a long frozen stream beginning to thaw. "What shall we name her?" Eleanor asked softly, her voice still somewhat halting and careful, though the sound of it never failed to fill Alistair's chest with wonder and gratitude, remembering vividly the day he had first heard her secret humming, and how far they had traveled together since that unexpected moment. Alistair considered the question thoughtfully, watching his tiny daughter's peaceful, sleeping face. "Beatrice," he said finally, "after my grandmother, who saw the goodness in you before I allowed myself to recognize it fully, and who would have loved this child dearly, I believe, had she lived to see this day." Eleanor's eyes filled with grateful tears, and she nodded, clearly moved by the tribute to the woman who had first suspected, long before either of them, that their unusual marriage might grow into something far more precious than mere convenience. Weeks later, as spring finally began warming the grounds of Renfield Hall after the long winter, Alistair found Eleanor sitting in the nursery, the same forgotten room they had discovered together, on quiet evenings during their first months of marriage, now cheerfully restored, with fresh curtains and polished furniture, little Beatrice sleeping peacefully, in a beautifully carved cradle nearby. Eleanor hummed softly as she rocked the cradle gently, the same tender melody her own mother had once sung to her so many years earlier, before tragedy separated them forever, a melody that had traveled through unimaginable loss and hardship, to finally find its way to this new, innocent life, carrying forward a legacy of love that refused to be extinguished. Alistair paused quietly in the doorway, watching this peaceful scene with a heart so full of gratitude and love that words felt entirely inadequate to capture it. He thought of the cold, guarded man he had been on the day he first traveled to that workhouse, determined to protect his broken heart by choosing a silent bride who could never wound him with words nor affection. He had been wrong, he realized now, so completely and wonderfully wrong. Silence had not protected him from love at all. It had simply given love the quiet space it needed to grow slowly, patiently, until it became strong enough to heal wounds he had believed permanent, until a secret lullaby, hummed softly, in an empty room, had cracked open a heart he thought forever closed, revealing warmth and tenderness he never expected to feel again. Eleanor looked up and noticed him standing there, and she smiled, warm and genuine, gesturing him closer with a gentle wave of her hand. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, watching their daughter sleep peacefully to the sound of her mother's healing voice, finally restored after years of painful silence. "I chose you to avoid love," Alistair murmured softly, taking Eleanor's hand and pressing a gentle kiss against her palm. "Yet somehow, you gave me a deeper love than I ever believed possible, patient and quiet and true, exactly the kind of love I did not know I desperately needed." Eleanor leaned gently against his shoulder, her voice still soft and careful, though every word now carried the full weight of years of silence finally broken. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "some hearts need silence first, before they can truly learn to sing." Outside the nursery window, the first warm sunshine of spring spilled golden light across the awakening gardens of Renfield Hall, illuminating a family finally whole, a love finally free, and a quiet, tender lullaby that would continue echoing gently through those ancient halls for many joyful years still to come.